I was sitting in my favorite recliner, the same brown leather chair Beatrice bought me for our 40th wedding anniversary, when the phone rang that Tuesday evening in October. Outside my window, the Tennessee mountains were painted orange and gold by the setting sun, the same view I'd been blessed to wake up to for 37 years in this little house on Maple Street in Gatlinburg. The caller ID showed my son Calvin's name, but when I answered, the voice that came through sounded like a stranger. "We're going tomorrow, Father. I've sold your mountain lodge." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles went white, the same hands that had built that lodge board by board back in 1980. 43 years of memories, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer barbecues with Beatrice humming while she made her famous potato salad, all reduced to a simple sentence delivered without a trace of emotion. "The realtor said we got $180,000 for it," Calvin continued, his voice carrying that cold, businesslike tone I'd been hearing more and more lately. "Not bad for that old cabin, right? Anyway, Vanessa and I need the money for our European business venture. We leave for Switzerland in the morning." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That old cabin was where Beatrice and I had spent our honeymoon, where we'd taught Calvin and his sister Denise how to fish in Bear Creek, where I'd held my wife's hand during her final summer, watching sunsets from the porch swing I'd built with my own two hands. The same porch where she'd made me promise to never let anyone take our mountain away from our family. "Calvin," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Son, that lodge, it's been in our family for over 4 decades. Your mother and I dash." "Look, Pop," he interrupted, using the childhood nickname that now sounded like an insult. "We both know you can't maintain that place anymore. You're 74 years old. What do you need with some remote mountain property? Besides, we're being generous. We're giving you 30% of the sale. 30% of my own property. How thoughtful. If this happened to your father, would you stay silent? Subscribe now. You won't believe how this story ends." But here's what made me smile, even as my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. There was something my dear son didn't know. Something that would change everything. You see, my name is Ezekiel Washington. I'm 74 years old, and until that phone call, I thought I knew my son. I'd raised him to understand the value of family, taught him how to work with his hands, shown him what it meant to build something that would last. But sitting there in Beatrice's anniversary chair, listening to him discard our family legacy like yesterday's newspaper, I realized I'd been blind to who Calvin had really become. The truth was that worthless old mountain cabin Calvin had just sold wasn't just a family retreat. Hidden beneath those wooden floors was a secret worth more than he could possibly imagine. And the son who thought he was so clever, who believed he could outsmart his simple old father. He was about to learn that underestimating a man who'd survived the Jim Crow South, 2 tours in Vietnam, and 47 years working the steel mills was the biggest mistake of his life. "Calvin," I said quietly, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "You forgot one thing." "What are you talking about, Pop?" I laughed then, not with joy, but with the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd just watched his own child show their true colors. "You'll find out soon enough, son. Have a safe trip to Switzerland." And I hung up the phone. 6 months before that devastating phone call, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee black, no sugar, the same way I'd been drinking it since my army days, when the mailman knocked on my door. It wasn't unusual for Jerry to hand-deliver certified letters. We'd known each other for 15 years, ever since he took over the route from old Mr. Patterson. "Morning, Ezekiel," Jerry said, handing me an official-looking envelope. "Got something here that needs your signature. Looks important." The return address made my stomach flip, Tennessee Geological Survey Division. I signed for it with hands that were suddenly shaking, closed the door, and walked back to my kitchen table where the morning sun was streaming through Beatrice's lace curtains. The same curtains she'd hung the week before the cancer took her 2 years ago. I opened that envelope like I was defusing a bomb. Inside was a letter that would change my life forever. "Dear Mr. Washington, congratulations. The Mineral Rights Survey has been completed on your property located at Bear Mountain Ridge, Tennessee. The estimated value of the natural gas deposits beneath your land is $14.2 million. I read those words 3 times before they sank in. $14.2 million. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor. Beatrice and I had installed ourselves in 1987, but I barely noticed. I was too busy staring at numbers that didn't seem real. The letter continued. Appalachian Natural Gas Company is prepared to offer you $2.1 million upfront for drilling rights, with projected annual royalties of $400,000 for the next 20 years, pending environmental approval and lease agreement. That worthless piece of mountain land Beatrice and I had bought in 1980 for $8,000. The same rocky, steep property everyone said was too remote for anything useful, was sitting on a fortune. The realtor back then had actually tried to talk us out of the purchase. Nothing but rock and trees up there, Ezekiel, he'd said. You'd be better off putting that money in savings bonds. But Beatrice had fallen in love with the view from what would become our front porch. That's where we'll grow old together, she'd whispered, squeezing my hand as we stood on that ridge, looking out over the Cumberland Mountains. And so we'd scraped together every penny we had, took out a small loan, and bought our slice of heaven. For 43 years, that lodge had been our sanctuary. We'd driven up there every weekend in my old pickup truck, sometimes bringing Calvin and Denise when they were small, sometimes just the 2 of us when we needed to escape the noise of town life. I'd built every room of that cabin with my own hands, using lumber from trees I'd felled myself. Beatrice had sewn the curtains, painted the walls, and planted the wildflower garden that still bloomed every spring. After she passed, I'd kept going up there, sitting on our porch swing, talking to her like she was still beside me. The lodge wasn't just a building. It was 43 years of marriage, laughter, tears, dreams, and love made manifest in wood and stone. And now Calvin, my own flesh and blood, had treated it like a commodity to be liquidated for his next get-rich-quick scheme. But as I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by coffee-stained paperwork that proved my worthless mountain was worth millions, I realized something else. Over the past few months, I'd been watching Calvin change. The expensive clothes he'd suddenly started wearing, the new Mercedes in his driveway, the way his eyes would linger on my modest home, calculating, measuring, like he was already planning an estate sale. 3 weeks later, I made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew quiet, gentle Ezekiel Washington. I picked up the phone and called a number Judge Morrison had given me, his neighbor, a private investigator named Detective Torres. I need to know what my son is really up to, I told her during our first meeting at the diner on Highway 321. And I have a feeling I'm not going to like what you find. I was right about that. What Detective Torres uncovered in her investigation made my blood run cold and broke whatever was left of my heart. But it also gave me the ammunition I needed to teach Calvin a lesson he'd never forget. A lesson about respect, family, and the dangerous game of underestimating your elders. For 3 months after I received that letter about the natural gas deposits, I became a student of my own son's behavior. It started small, things a trusting father might dismiss as coincidence. But after 4 decades in the steel mills, where one wrong move could cost you your life, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. First, there were the clothes. Calvin had always been a practical dresser, khakis and polo shirts, sensible shoes that could handle his job as a construction supervisor. But suddenly, he was showing up to our Sunday dinners wearing designer suits that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. When I complimented his new look, he just shrugged and said business was good. Then came the car. One day I drove past his house on Willow Creek Road. Just happened to be in the neighborhood, I told myself, and there in his driveway sat a brand new silver Mercedes-Benz. The same driveway where his old Ford pickup had been parked for 8 years. When I asked him about it during our next phone call, he said Vanessa had gotten a promotion at her marketing firm and they'd decided to celebrate. But it was the way he looked at my house that really got my attention. During those Sunday dinners, I'd catch him staring at Beatrice's antique china cabinet, mentally cataloging the contents. He'd walk through my living room like an appraiser, his eyes lingering on my grandfather's Civil War sword hanging above the mantel, on the family photos scattered across my piano. One evening, I found him in my bedroom, standing in front of Beatrice's jewelry box. "Just looking for some aspirin, Pop," he said when I asked what he was doing. Vanessa has a headache. The bathroom medicine cabinet was 20 feet down the hall. He knew exactly where the aspirin was kept. That's when I called Judge Morrison. Harold Morrison and I had been neighbors for 12 years, ever since he retired from the bench and bought the blue house on the corner of Maple and Oak. We'd shared many a cup of coffee on his front porch, talking about everything from Tennessee football to the state of the world. If anyone would know an honest private investigator, it would be Harold. Torres is the best in East Tennessee, he told me that Saturday morning, leaning against his fence while I pretended to water my azaleas. She's expensive, but she gets results. Helped me with a case a few years back, suspected insurance fraud. Woman caught the defendant red-handed with video evidence. The next Monday, I found myself sitting across from Detective Isabella Torres in a booth at Smoky Mountain Diner on Highway 321. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp brown eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of uncovering other people's secrets. "Tell me what you've observed," she said, pulling out a small notebook. I told her everything. The expensive clothes, the Mercedes, the calculating looks, the way Calvin had been asking subtle questions about my finances and my will. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in handwriting so neat it could have been typed. "How long has this been going on?" she asked when I finished. "The changes started about 4 months ago," I said. "Right around the time I think he and Vanessa started having marriage problems." "What makes you think they're having problems?" "She hasn't come to Sunday dinner in 6 weeks. And last time I called their house, Calvin answered, but I could hear her crying in the background. When I asked if everything was okay, he said she was just watching a sad movie." Detective Torres closed her notebook and looked at me with an expression that was half sympathy, half steel. "Mr. Washington, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you prepared for the possibility that what I find might change your relationship with your son forever?" I thought about Beatrice, about the promises I'd made to her in those final days, about the lodge we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared, the family legacy she'd trusted me to protect. "Detective Torres," I said, "I've already lost my wife to cancer and watched my daughter move 3,000 miles away to California. If my son is planning to betray the family that raised him, I need to know. Whatever it takes." She nodded. "I'll need 3 weeks. Maybe less if he's being careless. I'll want to document his daily activities, financial transactions if possible, and anyone he's meeting with regularly. This won't be cheap, $150 a day plus expenses." I thought about that letter from the Geological Survey, about the $14.2 million worth of natural gas sitting beneath my worthless mountain property. "Money isn't a problem," I said. "Just find me the truth." 3 weeks later, Detective Torres called me at 7 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Her voice was grim. "We need to meet," she said. "Today. And Mr. Washington, you're going to want to sit down for what I have to tell you." I met Detective Torres at the same diner where we'd first talked, but this time she looked like a woman who hadn't slept in days. She had a manila folder thick with photographs and documents, and when she slid into the booth across from me, her hands were shaking slightly. "Before I show you this," she said, "I want you to know that in 20 years of investigating infidelity, insurance fraud, and missing persons cases, I have never uncovered anything this cold-blooded. Are you sure you're ready?" I nodded, though my mouth had gone dry as desert sand. She opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. The first showed Calvin sitting in a restaurant I didn't recognize, across from a man in an expensive suit. Both men were smiling, raising champagne glasses in what looked like a celebration. "The man with your son is Harrison Kent," Detective Torres said. "Age 42, originally from Memphis. And Mr. Washington, he has a very interesting criminal history." She handed me a printed background check that made my blood freeze. Harrison Kent had been convicted of elder fraud in 3 different states over the past 15 years. His specialty was targeting elderly property owners, gaining their trust or the trust of their family members, then systematically stealing their assets. He'd served 2 prison sentences and was currently on probation in Tennessee. "Your son has been meeting with this man twice a week for the past month," she continued. "Always at expensive restaurants, always paying cash. But that's not the worst part. She pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table between us. I was able to get close enough to record one of their conversations, she said. This was taken 3 nights ago at a steakhouse in Knoxville. She pressed play, and Calvin's voice filled the small booth. But this wasn't the Calvin I'd raised, the boy who used to help me fix cars in our garage and called me every Father's Day without fail. This was a stranger, and what he said made me question everything I thought I knew about my own son. The old man won't be a problem much longer, Calvin's voice said clearly. He's 74, lives alone, no close friends except that busybody neighbor. Once we liquidate his assets and get him into one of those state-run nursing homes, we'll have all the time in the world. Harrison's voice responded. What about his daughter in California? Denise barely calls him twice a year, Calvin said, and I could hear him laughing. She's got her own life, her own problems. She won't interfere. Besides, by the time anyone realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone. And you're sure about the property values? I had it appraised quietly through a contact at the bank, Calvin said. The house is worth maybe $180,000, the mountain cabin another $150,000. Plus he's got about $80,000 in savings and that old life insurance policy from the steel mill. We're talking close to $500,000, Harrison. Enough to disappear completely. What about the wife? Vanessa? There was a pause, and when Calvin spoke again, his voice was colder than a January morning. Vanessa doesn't know about any of this. She thinks we're planning a legitimate business venture in Europe. By the time she figures out the truth, it'll be too late for her to stop us. Detective Torres reached over and turned off the recorder. The silence in that diner booth was deafening. There's more, she said quietly. Harrison Kent isn't just planning to steal your assets. Based on his pattern with previous victims, once they've transferred your property and emptied your accounts, they'll likely arrange for you to have some kind of accident. Maybe a fall down the stairs, maybe a medication mix-up. Something that looks natural but eliminates the only witness to their crimes. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. This wasn't just theft. My own son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the man I'd walked down the aisle at his wedding, was planning to kill me. How many other families has this Harrison targeted? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Based on the FBI database, at least 17 elderly victims across Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia over the past 10 years. The pattern is always the same. Gain access through a family member, isolate the victim, liquidate their assets, then eliminate them before they can report the crime. The families think their elderly relative died of natural causes, never knowing they were murdered for their inheritances. I thought about Beatrice, about the promises I'd made to her, about the lodge where we'd shared 43 years of love and dreams, now reduced to a line item in my son's criminal enterprise. What can we do legally? I asked. With the recording and the evidence I've gathered, we have enough to arrest both of them for conspiracy to commit fraud. But Mr. Washington, there's something else you need to know. Something that might change how you want to handle this. She pulled out one more document, another property deed that made my heart stop. During my investigation, I discovered that your mountain lodge was never legally transferred to Calvin's name. According to Tennessee property records, you're still the sole owner. Which means the sale he's planning is completely fraudulent, I finished. Exactly. Your son is about to commit a federal crime by attempting to sell property he doesn't own. And when the buyers discover the fraud, Calvin and Harrison will be facing serious prison time. I sat there in that booth, staring at the evidence of my son's betrayal, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Calvin thought he was so clever, so much smarter than his simple old father. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the man who taught him everything he knew about planning ahead. Detective Torres, I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. I need you to help me with something that's going to require perfect timing and absolute precision. What do you have in mind? I thought about that geological survey letter sitting in my kitchen drawer, about the $14.2 million worth of natural gas that Calvin believed was worthless rock and dirt. I thought about 43 years of memories he was willing to sell for pocket change, and about the wife he was planning to abandon after stealing everything I'd worked a lifetime to build. I'm going to give my son exactly what he thinks he wants, I said. And then I'm going to teach him why you should never try to outsmart the man who taught you how to think. That evening, I drove home through the winding mountain roads, past the familiar landmarks of a life I'd built with honest work and stubborn determination. The autumn leaves were turning gold and red, just like they had every October for the 74 years I'd called Tennessee home. But tonight, those mountains looked different to me. Tonight, they looked like justice. That night, I sat in my kitchen until 3 a.m, spread out before me like a general's battle plan. Detective Torres' photographs, the recorded conversation transcript, the geological survey papers, and the property deeds. Beatrice's old coffee pot gurgled in the corner, filling the house with the smell that had comforted me through 47 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood. But tonight, I wasn't looking for comfort. I was planning the education of my son. The first decision was the hardest. Should I simply call the FBI and let them arrest Calvin and Harrison? It would be clean, legal, and final. But as I stared at a photo of my son raising a champagne toast with a known killer, I realized that wouldn't teach him anything. He'd just become another criminal caught by the system, blaming everyone but himself for his choices. No, Calvin needed to understand exactly what he'd lost when he chose greed over family. He needed to experience the same shock, the same betrayal, the same helpless rage I'd felt when I heard him planning my death. Only then might he comprehend the magnitude of his sins. I opened my address book, the same leather-bound one Beatrice had given me for Christmas 1985, and found the number for Clarence Booker, the best attorney in East Tennessee. Clarence and I had grown up together in the same neighborhood, back when Gatlinburg was still a small mountain town instead of a tourist destination. He'd fought his way through law school while I was fighting my way through Vietnam, and for 50 years, we'd maintained the kind of friendship that only comes from shared struggles. Ezekiel. Clarence's voice was groggy when he answered on the 4th ring. Do you know what time it is? I know, Clarence. But I need your help, and it can't wait. What's wrong? Are you hurt? Not physically, I said. But I need to see you first thing in the morning. And Clarence, what I'm about to tell you is going to shock you worse than anything you heard in 30 years on the bench. We met at his office at 7 a.m., before his secretary arrived. Clarence listened without interrupting as I played Detective Torres' recording and showed him the evidence. When I finished, he sat back in his leather chair and whistled low. Ezekiel, this is attempted murder. We should call the FBI immediately. That's what the detective said. But I want to try something different first. I outlined my plan. Clarence's eyebrows climbed higher with each detail. You want to let them think the sale is going through? He asked. I want Calvin to believe he succeeded. I want him to experience the full weight of his victory before he learns the truth about what he's really done. And the mineral rights? That's the beautiful part, I said, pulling out the geological survey. The gas company is willing to delay the drilling announcement until I give them the word. As far as the world knows, that mountain property is exactly as worthless as Calvin believes. Clarence was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers. Finally, he looked up at me with something like admiration in his eyes. You know, if your son wasn't planning to kill you, I might feel sorry for him. Over the next 3 days, we put together a plan that would have impressed son sue himself. First, we created a shell company, Washington Holdings LLC, and quietly transferred the true ownership of the mountain lodge to it. Calvin would remain listed as beneficiary in my will, but legally, I maintained complete control until my death. Second, we arranged for surveillance equipment to be installed at the lodge. Every conversation, every moment of Calvin's fraudulent sale attempt would be recorded in high definition. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, who thought he was so clever, would provide all the evidence needed to convict himself. Third, and most importantly, we coordinated with Appalachian Natural Gas Company to have their representatives arrive at the property at the exact same time Calvin was showing it to his buyers. The timing had to be perfect. Calvin needed to hear about the $14.2 million in mineral rights at the precise moment he thought he was completing his theft. Are you sure about this, Ezekiel? Clarence asked as we finalized the details. Once we set this in motion, there's no going back. Your relationship with Calvin will be over forever. I thought about that for a long moment, then pulled out my wallet and showed him a photo I'd carried for 40 years. Calvin at age 6, standing on the porch of our mountain lodge, holding up a fish he'd caught in Bear Creek. His smile was so bright it could have lit up the whole mountain. "Clarence," I said, "my son died the day he decided to kill me for money. What's left is just a stranger wearing his face." But even as I said those words, part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me prayed that when Calvin saw the magnitude of what he'd thrown away, something of the boy I'd raised might still be salvageable. The next morning, I called the lodge's phone number. The landline Calvin didn't know I still maintained, and left a message on the answering machine. My voice was shaky, defeated, exactly what Calvin would expect from a broken old man. "Son, it's your father. I accept what you've done. I know you need the money for your business. I'll be staying with neighbor Morrison for the next few weeks while you handle the sale. I love you, Calvin. I hope someday you'll understand why this breaks my heart." When I hung up, I was surprised to discover that my performance wasn't entirely an act. Despite everything he'd planned, despite the recording of him celebrating my future death, Calvin was still my son. And losing him to his own greed was going to hurt worse than losing Beatrice to cancer. But unlike cancer, this was a disease with a cure. The question was whether Calvin would choose to take it. The mountain lodge looked exactly as it had for 43 years when I drove up the winding gravel road that Thursday morning, 2 days before Calvin's planned sale. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Beatrice's wildflowers were showing their last brave blooms before the frost claimed them. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear her humming while she tended her garden, could almost smell the coffee she used to brew in the old percolator on the wood-burning stove. But I wasn't here for memories. I was here for justice. Detective Torres met me at the front door, carrying a duffel bag full of surveillance equipment that looked like something out of a spy movie. Behind her stood 2 technicians from the security company Clarence had hired, professionals who specialized in corporate espionage cases. "Morning, Mr. Washington," Torres said. "We'll have everything installed within 3 hours. Calvin won't be able to speak a word in this lodge without us hearing it. Would you stay silent if someone was planning your death? Subscribe. The revenge about to happen will leave you speechless." The technicians worked with surgical precision, installing tiny cameras in the light fixtures, microphones in the ceiling beams, and recording equipment in the basement that Calvin had never bothered to explore. Every conversation, every facial expression, every moment of his betrayal would be captured in perfect detail. While they worked, I walked through the lodge one last time, touching surfaces that held a lifetime of memories. Here was the kitchen table where Beatrice had taught Calvin to play checkers. There was the stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows during his childhood camping trips. And over there, the bedroom window where she'd pointed out constellations to him on summer nights, teaching him the stories behind each star. How had that sweet boy become the man on Detective Torres' recording, coldly planning his father's death? Where had we gone wrong? "Mr. Washington?" One of the technicians called from the living room. "We're ready to test the system." I stood in the center of the main room and spoke in a normal voice. "My name is Ezekiel Washington, and I built this lodge with my own hands in 1980. The technician checked his equipment and nodded. "Crystal clear. We'll catch every word." Torres handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. "This is a two-way radio. You'll be able to hear everything happening in the lodge from Judge Morrison's house, and you can communicate with us if needed." "And the gas company representatives? They'll arrive at exactly 2 p.m. tomorrow, just as Calvin is showing the property to his fake buyers. The timing will be perfect." As the technicians packed up their equipment, I took one last walk around the property. The creek where Calvin had caught his first fish still bubbled over the same rocks. The oak tree where I'd hung his tire swing still stretched its branches toward the sky. The workshop where I'd taught him to use tools still held the scent of sawdust and motor oil. Every corner of this place held evidence of the love I'd poured into raising him. And tomorrow, Calvin would try to sell it all to fund his escape after murdering me. I locked the front door and drove back down the mountain, my heart heavier with each mile. At the bottom of the ridge, I pulled over and called Calvin's cell phone. "Pop." He sounded surprised to hear from me. "How are you holding up?" The concern in his voice was so convincing that for a moment, I almost doubted the evidence. Almost believed this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But then I remembered Harrison Kent's criminal record, remembered the recorded conversation where Calvin laughed about putting me in a state nursing home. "I'm getting by, son," I said, putting just the right amount of weariness in my voice. "I wanted to tell you that I put some personal items in the basement storage room. Family photos, your mother's recipes, things like that. In case the new owners don't want them cluttering up the house." That's thoughtful of you, Pop. Are you sure you're okay with the sale? What choice do I have?" I said. "You're right that I can't maintain the place anymore. And if you need the money for your business venture." "We do, Pop. This opportunity in Switzerland could set us up for life." Switzerland. Even now, he was lying to me about his destination, his plans, his future. Even now, he couldn't bring himself to tell his father the truth about anything. "Well, I hope it works out for you and Vanessa," I said. "Will she be at the sale tomorrow?" "No, she's busy with work. It'll just be me and Harrison." Of course it would be. Calvin wouldn't want his wife to witness his father's final humiliation. "Okay, son. I love you." There was a pause before he answered, and I wondered if somewhere deep down, Calvin felt even a flicker of guilt about what he was planning. "I love you too, Pop." But love, I'd learned, was just a word when it came without respect, without honor, without the willingness to sacrifice for family instead of sacrificing family for personal gain. That night, I sat on Judge Morrison's front porch, testing the radio equipment and listening to the empty sounds of the mountain lodge. Tomorrow, that silence would be broken by the voices of men who thought they were clever enough to steal from an old fool. They were about to learn the difference between age and wisdom. And Calvin was about to discover that the father he'd underestimated had been planning his education long before Calvin had started planning his death. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made the Tennessee mountains look like a postcard. I sat in Judge Morrison's living room, the two-way radio crackling softly in my ear as I watched the empty gravel road that led up to my lodge. At exactly 1:45 p.m., a black SUV appeared, winding its way up the mountain like a snake heading toward its prey. "Here they come," I whispered into the radio. Detective Torres' voice crackled back. "We see them. 2 men in the vehicle. That's Calvin and Harrison. The fake buyers should arrive in about 10 minutes. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the volume. After 43 years of Sunday dinners, fishing trips, and heart-to-heart talks, I was about to watch my son commit a federal crime against his own father. Through the radio, I heard car doors slamming, followed by Calvin's voice. "Perfect timing, Harrison. The buyers should be here any minute." "Beautiful property," Harrison Kent replied, and even through the tiny speaker, his voice sounded like oil sliding over broken glass. Hard to believe the old man's just going to hand over all this for nursing home money. Calvin laughed, a sound that cut through my heart like a rusty blade. He doesn't have a choice. By the time we're done, he'll be grateful we're taking care of his affairs. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I'd heard Calvin laugh with genuine joy instead of this cold calculation. It had been years. At exactly 2 p.m., a white sedan pulled up beside the SUV. 2 men in business suits got out. The actors Harrison had hired to pose as property buyers. I watched through Judge Morrison's window as they shook hands with Calvin and Harrison, all smiles and professional courtesy. "Mr. Washington," one of the fake buyers said, his voice clear through the surveillance system. "I'm Tom Bradley from Atlanta. This is my partner, Jeff Morrison. We're very excited about this property." "Please call me Calvin," my son replied. "Let me show you around the main lodge first, then we can walk the property boundaries." For the next 20 minutes, I listened to Calvin give a tour of the home Beatrice and I had built with our own hands. He pointed out the stone fireplace where we'd spent countless winter evenings, the kitchen where she'd taught him to make biscuits from scratch, the bedroom where I'd read him stories every night for 10 years. And with each memory he shared, he was putting a price tag on it. "The electrical system was updated in 2018, Calvin said as they walked through the living room. "Plumbing is solid, septic system was inspected last year. You're getting a turnkey property here. And you're sure about the price?" Tom Bradley asked. "150 seems almost too good to be true for this much land." My father needs to liquidate quickly for medical expenses, Calvin replied smoothly. He's motivated to close fast. Medical expenses. Even in his lies, Calvin was using my supposed vulnerability to justify his theft. That's when I heard the second set of vehicles approaching up the mountain road. What's that? Harrison's voice came through the radio, sharp with suspicion. Through the surveillance feed, I could see Calvin walking to the front window. Looks like 2 pickup trucks. Probably just hunters or hikers. But these weren't hunters. These were representatives from Appalachian Natural Gas Company, arriving exactly on schedule for their routine survey follow-up appointment. The truck doors slammed, and I heard heavy boots on the gravel driveway. Then came the voice I'd been waiting to hear, Chuck Reynolds, the lead geologist from the gas company. "Excuse me," Chuck called out. "Are you folks the property owners?" "I'm Chuck Reynolds from Appalachian Natural Gas. We have an appointment for a follow-up survey on the mineral rights." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat through the radio. Then Calvin's voice, confused and wary. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. This is just a residential property. There's no gas drilling up here." Chuck Reynolds laughed. "Oh, you might be surprised, sir. This ridge sits on one of the richest natural gas deposits in East Tennessee. We completed our survey 6 months ago. The property owner should have received our preliminary report by now." "Property owner?" Calvin's voice was getting higher. "I'm Calvin Washington. This is my family's lodge." "Washington, you said?" Chuck pulled out a tablet and scrolled through his files. "Yes, here it is. Ezekiel Washington, age 74. Is that your father?" "Yes, but he's in poor health. I'm handling his affairs." Chuck nodded sympathetically. "Well, I hope he's recovering well, because this is going to be the best news he's heard in years. The gas deposits under this property are worth approximately $14.2 million. The sound that came through my radio wasn't quite human. It was somewhere between a gasp and a scream. The sound of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. 14.2. What did you say?" Calvin's voice was barely a whisper. $1 million, Chuck repeated cheerfully. "We're prepared to offer $2.1 million up front for drilling rights, plus annual royalties of $400,000 for the next 20 years. Your father is about to become a very wealthy man." Tom Bradley, one of the fake buyers, was the first to speak. I think we need to reconsider our offer. If this property has that kind of mineral value." "No." Calvin's voice was desperate now. "The sale is already agreed upon. We have a contract." But Harrison Kent, criminal mastermind that he was, had immediately grasped the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. "Calvin," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled greed, "we need to talk. Privately." Through the radio, I heard footsteps walking away from the main group, then Harrison's voice, low and urgent. "Do you understand what just happened? We're not talking about $500,000 anymore. We're talking about $14 million. But the buyers are here," Calvin said. "The sale is supposed to happen today. Forget the buyers." Harrison snapped. "We need to get control of those mineral rights. Can you get your father to sign them over? He's staying with his neighbor. He thinks I'm just selling the lodge for $150,000. Then we go to him tonight. We tell him about the gas deposits, convince him to sign everything over to you for management purposes, then disappear before he realizes what happened." I was gripping Judge Morrison's coffee table, so hard my knuckles had gone white. Even now, even after discovering they'd stumbled onto a fortune, Calvin and Harrison were planning to steal it from me. But that's when Chuck Reynolds dropped the second bomb. "Oh, there is one thing I should mention," the geologist called out to Calvin. "Our legal department did a title search on the property, and there seems to be some confusion about ownership. According to Tennessee state records, the current owner is listed as Washington Holdings LLC, not an individual. You might want to check with your father about that." The silence that followed was the sound of Calvin's entire criminal enterprise collapsing around his ears. "What do you mean, Washington Holdings?" Calvin's voice cracked like a teenager's. "My father owns this property. Ezekiel Washington. It's been in our family for 43 years. Chuck Reynolds consulted his tablet again. "I'm showing the transfer happened about a week ago. Let me read you the exact legal description. He rattled off a series of coordinates and property boundaries that meant nothing to the fake buyers, but everything to Calvin and Harrison. Harrison Kent's voice cut through the mountain air like a knife. "Calvin, we need to leave. Now." "But I don't understand," Calvin said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he sounded like the confused little boy I remembered. Pop never said anything about transferring ownership. He barely knows how to use email, let alone set up a corporation. Tom Bradley, still playing his role as a buyer, cleared his throat. "Well, this is certainly an unexpected development. I think we'll need to postpone any purchase discussions until the ownership question is resolved." "No, wait." Calvin's desperation was painful to hear. "This is just some paperwork mix-up. My father wouldn't. He couldn't." That's when Harrison Kent made the mistake that would seal both their fates. Instead of cutting his losses and running, greed made him double down. "Mr. Reynolds," Harrison said, his voice sliding back into its practiced charm, "there's obviously been some administrative error. Mr. Washington here has power of attorney for his elderly father. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to straighten this out." "Power of attorney?" Chuck Reynolds sounded interested. "Do you have those documents with you?" The silence stretched so long I thought the radio had malfunctioned. Then Calvin's voice, small and defeated. They're at my house." "I see. Well, you understand we can't proceed with any mineral rights discussions without proper authorization. Perhaps you should contact your father directly." That's when I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. My own voice, amplified through speakers Detective Torres had hidden around the property. "Calvin." My voice echoed across the mountain ridge like the voice of a ghost. "Calvin, this is your father." The gasp that came through the radio told me everything I needed to know about my son's state of mind. "Pop." Calvin called out, spinning around to look for the source of my voice. "Pop, where are you?" "I'm watching you, son. I've been watching you for weeks now. And I think it's time we had an honest conversation about family, respect, and the price of betrayal." Chuck Reynolds and his team were looking around in confusion, but Harrison Kent had figured out exactly what was happening. "It's a setup," he hissed to Calvin. "The old man's been playing us." "Hello, Harrison." My voice continued through the speakers. "I know all about your criminal record. 17 elderly victims across 3 states, wasn't it? Did you really think I was going to be number 18? The fake buyers were backing toward their car now, clearly wanting no part of whatever drama was about to unfold. Chuck Reynolds, however, seemed fascinated by the developing situation. "Pop, I don't understand," Calvin called out to the empty air. "Where are you? Why are you doing this?" The hurt in his voice almost broke my resolve. Almost. But then I remembered the recording Detective Torres had made, the sound of my own son laughing about putting me in a nursing home. "I'm going to play something for you, Calvin," I said through the speakers. "Something I think you'll recognize." The mountain ridge filled with the sound of Calvin's own voice from the steakhouse recording. "The old man won't be a problem much longer. He's 74, lives alone, no close friends except that busybody neighbor. Once we liquidate his assets and get him into one of those state-run nursing homes, we'll have all the time in the world." Calvin's face, which I could see clearly through the surveillance cameras, went white as fresh snow. "Pop, I can explain dash." "Explain what?" My amplified voice cut him off. "Explain how you planned to kill your own father for $500,000? Explain how you were willing to steal the lodge your mother loved more than anywhere on earth? Explain how you brought a convicted felon to help you commit elder fraud." Harrison Kent was frantically pulling out his cell phone, probably trying to call someone who could get him out of this mess. But cell service on Bear Mountain Ridge was spotty at best, and today, I'd made sure it was non-existent. "There's no signal, Harrison," I said through the speakers. "I had the cell tower shut down for maintenance this afternoon." Amazing what a sizable donation to the Wright County Commissioner can accomplish. Chuck Reynolds stepped forward, his professional curiosity overriding his personal discomfort with the family drama unfolding around him. "Mr. Washington, the elder Mr. Washington, are you saying that these men were attempting to fraudulently sell your property?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Mr. Reynolds. And I have 3 weeks' worth of surveillance footage to prove it." Calvin was looking around wildly now, searching the treeline and the lodge's roof for the cameras he suddenly realized must be everywhere. "But Pop, the money," he he said, his voice breaking. Vanessa and I, we needed the money for dash. For what, Calvin? For your gambling debts? For the loans you took out without telling your wife? For your plan to disappear to South America with this killer you call a business partner? Each revelation hit Calvin like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his face cycling through shock, denial, and dawning horror as he realized the full scope of what his father knew. Harrison Kent, meanwhile, had moved beyond panic and into pure survival mode. Calvin, he barked, we're leaving. Now, get in the truck. But Calvin wasn't moving. He was staring up at the lodge, his childhood home, the place where he'd learned to fish and hunt and work with his hands, as if seeing it for the first time. $14 million, he whispered. The property was worth $14 million. That's right, son, my voice echoed across the mountain. The worthless mountain land you were so eager to sell was sitting on enough natural gas to set our family up for generations. But you threw it all away for a few $100,000 and the chance to murder the man who gave you life. Calvin fell to his knees in the gravel driveway, the same driveway where I'd taught him to ride a bicycle 35 years ago. What have I done? He said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it through the surveillance equipment. Oh God, what have I done? That's when we all heard the sirens. The sirens grew louder as they wound up the mountain road, their wail echoing off the rocky cliffs like the voices of long-dead spirits seeking justice. Calvin was still on his knees in the gravel, staring at the lodge with the hollow eyes of a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. Harrison Kent, however, was moving with the desperate efficiency of a career criminal who'd been caught before. Calvin, Harrison barked, grabbing my son by the arm. Get up. We can still get out of this if we move fast. But Calvin wasn't hearing him anymore. He was lost somewhere in his own private hell, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. $14 million, he kept repeating. It was worth $14 million. The first police cruiser crested the ridge, followed by two more and an unmarked sedan that I knew belonged to Detective Torres. Chuck Reynolds from the gas company was backing away from the scene, clearly wishing he'd scheduled his survey for another day entirely. Mr. Reynolds, my voice called through the speakers, thank you for your assistance. You might want to move your truck, it's about to get crowded up here. Detective Torres was the first out of her vehicle, weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. Behind her came 4 FBI agents in tactical gear. Apparently, conspiracy to commit elder fraud involving murder was serious enough to warrant federal attention. Harrison Kent, Torres called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been hunting criminals for 20 years. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. Harrison's response was to run. He made it about 50 yards into the tree line before the FBI's tracking dog brought him down. The sounds coming through my radio, crashing branches, shouted commands, and Harrison's increasingly desperate curses, would have been comical if the situation weren't so tragic. Calvin, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He sat in the gravel like a broken man, watching the agents secure the scene around him. Calvin Washington, Torres said, approaching my son with handcuffs ready. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted elder abuse. That's when Calvin finally looked up, his eyes searching the air as if he could see me hiding in the mountains. Pop, he called out, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy's. Pop, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The words I'd been waiting to hear for weeks, and they broke my heart instead of healing it. Through the surveillance cameras, I watched Detective Torres read Calvin his rights while FBI agents documented the scene. The fake buyers had given their statements and been released. They were actors, not criminals, caught up in something far bigger than they'd signed up for. But I couldn't watch anymore. I handed the radio to Judge Morrison and walked out onto his back porch, staring up at the mountain ridge where my family's legacy was supposed to live on. Instead, it had become the site of the deepest betrayal I'd ever experienced. Judge Morrison followed me outside, his weathered hands carrying 2 cups of coffee. Ezekiel, he said quietly, you know you did the right thing. Did I, Harold? That's my son up there in handcuffs. My boy. Your boy was planning to kill you for money, Morrison reminded me gently. That man up there isn't the child you raised. Haven't been for a long time. Through the radio, I could hear Calvin being loaded into the police cruiser. But instead of the defiance or anger I'd expected, there was only broken sobbing. "I want to talk to him," I said. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's wise? I need to know if there's anything left of my son inside that stranger." I picked up the radio and keyed the microphone. "Detective Torres, this is Ezekiel Washington. Before you take him down the mountain, I'd like 5 minutes." Torres' voice crackled back. "Are you sure, Mr. Washington? He's in custody now. You don't have to face him if you don't want to." "I need to." 10 minutes later, I was standing face to face with Calvin for the first time since this nightmare began. He was handcuffed and flanked by 2 FBI agents, but what struck me most was how small he looked. The expensive clothes that had marked his transformation into a stranger now hung on him like a costume he'd outgrown. "Pop," he whispered when he saw me. "Pop, I dash." "Don't," I said, holding up a hand to stop him. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say you didn't mean it. I heard every word you said to Harrison Kent. I know exactly what you meant to do." Calvin's face crumpled. "I was scared, Pop. The debts, the pressure. I thought I didn't have any choice." "You had choices, Calvin. You could have come to me for help. You could have told me about your gambling problem, about the loans, about Harrison Kent. Instead, you chose to see me as an obstacle to be removed." "I know. God help me, I know." Calvin was crying openly now, his tears cutting tracks through the mountain dust on his cheeks. "When I heard about the mineral rights, when I realized what that property was really worth, Pop, I threw away everything for pocket change. I threw away my family, my integrity, my soul. For just a moment, I heard an echo of the boy I'd raised, the child who'd cried in my arms when his goldfish died, who'd apologized for breaking windows with tearful sincerity. What about Vanessa?" I asked. "She doesn't know," Calvin said quickly, "about any of it. She thinks I'm on a business trip to Nashville. Pop, promise me you won't let my sins destroy her life too." At least he still cared about someone other than himself. "The gambling debts are real?" I asked. Calvin nodded miserably. $87,000. "And there are other debts Harrison convinced me to take on. Credit cards, personal loans. Vanessa thinks I got promoted at work. She doesn't know we're about to lose the house." Detective Torres stepped forward. "Mr. Washington, we need to get him processed." I looked at my son, really looked at him, for what I knew might be the last time. Somewhere under the designer clothes and the criminal choices, I could still see traces of the 6-year-old boy who'd caught his first fish in Bear Creek. "Calvin," I said, "your mother would be heartbroken by what you've become. But she'd also want me to tell you that it's not too late to find your way back to being the man she raised." "How?" he asked desperately. "How do I come back from planning to kill my own father?" "You start by taking responsibility for every choice you made. No excuses, no justifications, no blaming anyone else. And then you spend whatever time you have left making amends." The FBI agents were getting impatient, shifting their weight and checking their watches. "Pop," Calvin said as they started to guide him toward the police cruiser. "The lodge, what will happen to it?" I thought about that question for a long moment. The lodge where we'd shared so many happy memories, now forever tainted by the knowledge of what Calvin had planned to do there. "I don't know, son. I honestly don't know." As I watched the police cars disappear down the mountain road, taking my son to face federal charges, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely, knowing I was safe in my own home. But the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but at the cost of losing my son forever. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of lawyers, FBI interviews, and media attention that I never wanted. The story of the elderly widower who outsmarted his son's murder plot made national news, complete with reporters camped out at the bottom of my driveway and phone calls from television producers wanting to buy the rights to my story. I turned them all down. This wasn't entertainment. This was the destruction of a family. Calvin and Harrison had been denied bail. Harrison because of his flight risk and prior convictions, Calvin because the evidence of premeditated elder abuse was overwhelming. They were housed in separate facilities while awaiting trial, which meant I didn't have to worry about Harrison's influence corrupting my son any further. But it was the call I received on a Wednesday morning that really drove home the scope of Calvin's betrayal. "Mr. Washington?" The voice was female, young, and shaking with emotion. "This is Vanessa, Calvin's wife. I think we need to talk." She came to my house that afternoon, driving a beat-up Honda instead of the Mercedes I'd seen in Calvin's driveway. Her eyes were red from crying, and she carried herself like someone who'd been punched in the stomach and was still trying to catch her breath. "I don't know where to start," she said, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "The FBI told me everything. About the gambling, about Harrison Kent, about what Calvin was planning to do to you." "Vanessa Dash," I started, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this." She took a shaky breath. I knew something was wrong. The new clothes, the car, the way Calvin had been acting. But I thought maybe he'd gotten a promotion he hadn't told me about yet. Or maybe he'd made some good investments. "You couldn't have known," I said gently. "But I should have asked harder questions. I should have demanded to know where the money was coming from." She looked up at me with eyes full of guilt and shame. "Mr. Washington, I am so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't protect you from my own husband. That broke my heart more than anything Calvin had done. This young woman, barely 30 years old, was taking responsibility for crimes she'd had no part in. Vanessa, Calvin's choices are not your fault." "The house is gone," she said, changing the subject abruptly. "The bank foreclosed yesterday. It turns out Calvin had taken out 3 different loans using the property as collateral. I'm staying with my sister in Nashville until I figure out what to do next." I thought about the $14.2 million in mineral rights, about the comfortable life I could afford now that the gas company had finalized their drilling contracts. I thought about Beatrice, about what she would have wanted me to do. "Vanessa," I said, "I have a proposition for you." She looked up suspiciously. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Washington. I won't take money from the man my husband tried to kill. It's not charity. It's a job offer." I explained my plan. The natural gas royalties would start flowing in about 6 months, and I was going to need help managing the financial and legal aspects. More importantly, I wanted to establish a foundation to help other elderly people who were being victimized by family members or con artists. "I need someone I can trust," I said. "Someone who understands what it's like to be betrayed by someone you love. Someone who won't be tempted by easy money because they've seen where that road leads." Vanessa stared at me for a long moment. "You want me to run your foundation? I want you to help me make sure other families don't go through what ours has." "But Calvin, my husband tried to murder you. Your husband made his choices. You're not responsible for them, and you shouldn't be punished for them. The question is, what choices are you going to make now?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might refuse. Then slowly she nodded. "I'd like that. I'd like to do something good with all this pain." That evening, I drove up to the mountain lodge for the first time since Calvin's arrest. The surveillance equipment had been removed, the police tape taken down, but the place still felt different somehow, tainted by the knowledge of what had almost happened here. I walked through the rooms where Calvin had planned to sell away 43 years of memories, past the kitchen table where I'd taught him to play chess, through the bedroom where Beatrice had sung him lullabies. Every corner held reminders of the family we used to be. But as I sat on the front porch swing, watching the sun set over the Cumberland Mountains, I realized something important. The lodge itself wasn't the problem. The memories weren't tainted. Calvin's betrayal couldn't reach back in time and poison the love Beatrice and I had poured into raising him. Those memories belonged to us, not to him. And no amount of greed or criminal conspiracy could take them away. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed the number for the county jail. "You have a collect call from Calvin Washington," the automated voice said. "Do you accept?" I stared at the phone for a long moment, then pressed the button to decline the call. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. Maybe someday, when the wounds weren't so fresh and the betrayal didn't sting quite so badly. Maybe when he'd served his time and proven that he understood the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. But not today. Today, I was going to sit on my porch swing, watch the sunset over my $14 million mountain, and remember what it felt like to be a father who was proud of his son. Tomorrow, I would start building something new from the wreckage of our family. A foundation that would help other elderly people avoid the trap I'd almost fallen into. A legacy that would honor Beatrice's memory and maybe, just maybe, show Calvin what he could have been if he'd chosen love over greed. The mountain held its peace around me, and for the first time in months, that was enough. 6 months after Calvin's arrest, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Beatrice Washington Foundation, watching Vanessa present our first quarterly report to the board of directors. The foundation occupied the top floor of a renovated building in downtown Gatlinburg, with large windows that looked out over the same mountains where my family's story had played out. "We've helped 43 families in our first 6 months," Vanessa was saying, her voice steady and professional. "Prevented an estimated $2.8 million in elder fraud, and worked with law enforcement to arrest 12 individuals involved in family-based financial abuse." The board members, retired judges, social workers, and financial experts nodded approvingly. But I was watching Vanessa's face, seeing the quiet satisfaction there. She'd found purpose in our shared tragedy, transforming her pain into protection for others. "The most common pattern we're seeing," she continued, "is adult children with gambling or drug addictions targeting their elderly parents' assets. In 60% of cases, the parents suspected something was wrong but didn't know where to turn for help." After the meeting, Vanessa and I walked out onto the building's rooftop terrace. The October air was crisp, reminding me of that day when Calvin had called to tell me he'd sold the lodge. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "How are you holding up?" I asked her. "Really?" Vanessa was quiet for a moment, looking out over the mountains. "Some days are harder than others. I still wake up sometimes thinking Calvin's going to be there, that this was all some terrible nightmare. But then I remember the recording you played, the things he said about you, and I know that man wasn't the person I married. Have you visited him?" She shook her head. "I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Is that awful of me?" "No," I said. "It's honest. And honesty is the only way to heal from something like this." Calvin's trial had ended 3 weeks earlier. He'd pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years in federal prison. Harrison Kent, with his prior convictions, had received 25 to life. Both men would spend their best years behind bars, paying for their crimes against elderly victims across multiple states. The hardest part had been testifying at Calvin's sentencing hearing. The judge had asked me to speak about the impact of his crimes, and I'd found myself looking directly at my son as I described the fear, the betrayal, the sleepless nights knowing my own child was planning my death. Calvin had cried during my testimony. Real tears, not the manipulative performance he'd put on during his arrest. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Calvin had stood and looked directly at me. "Your Honor," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't expect forgiveness from my father or my wife. I don't deserve it. But I want them to know that I take full responsibility for every choice I made. I brought shame on my family, dishonored my mother's memory, and nearly destroyed the man who gave me everything. I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became someone capable of such evil." The judge had been unmoved by Calvin's words, and frankly, so had I. Remorse was easy when you were facing prison time. The real test would be what Calvin did with the next decade of his life. "Mr. Washington?" Vanessa's voice brought me back to the present. "There's something I need to tell you. I got a letter from Calvin yesterday." I felt my stomach tighten. "What did he say?" "He wanted me to know that he's been meeting with a counselor at the prison, trying to understand his gambling addiction and how it led to everything else. He said he's not asking for forgiveness, just wanted me to know that he's finally taking responsibility. How do you feel about that?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he's really changed. But the other part remembers that he was planning to kill you, and I don't know if I can ever get past that." That evening, I drove up to the mountain lodge for my weekly visit. I'd been going there every Wednesday since the trial ended, not to relive the nightmare, but to reclaim the place from the darkness Calvin had brought to it. Tonight, I had company. Chuck Reynolds from the gas company had called to let me know the drilling operation was ahead of schedule, and the first royalty check would arrive in about a month. The amount he mentioned made my head spin, $1.2 million, just for the first quarter. But as I sat on the porch swing, I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about the phone call I'd received that morning from Detective Torres. "Mr. Washington," she'd said, "I wanted to let you know we arrested another elder fraud ring operating out of Nashville. 3 family members were systematically stealing from their 80-year-old grandmother. But here's the thing. The grandmother's neighbor called our tip line after hearing about your case on the news. She said if you could stand up to your own son, she could stand up to her friends' grandchildren." Stories like that were becoming common. The media attention from Calvin's case had encouraged other elderly victims to come forward, other families to report suspicious behavior before it was too late. The Beatrice Washington Foundation was receiving calls from across the Southeast. Adult children asking for help with their own parents, elderly people reporting their suspicions about caregivers or family members. If this story helps just one family avoid our tragedy, share it now. Don't let another parent suffer what I endured. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was an unknown number with a Tennessee area code. "Mr. Washington, this is Patricia Nelson from Knoxville. I got your number from the foundation website. I think my son is stealing from me, and I don't know what to do." I spent the next hour talking Patricia through the warning signs I'd learned to recognize, connecting her with Detective Torres, and arranging for our foundation to provide her with legal and financial counseling. By the time I hung up, it was dark, and the mountain was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees. But I wasn't afraid of the darkness anymore. I'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable and survived it. More than survived, I'd turned it into something that could help others avoid the same trap. Beatrice would have been proud of that. Not proud of what Calvin had become, but proud of what I'd built from the wreckage of our family. As I locked up the lodge and headed back down the mountain, I realized something had changed. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. The foundation was growing, Vanessa was healing, and slowly, very slowly, I was learning to live with the loss of my son. Not forgive him, that might never come, but live with it and build something meaningful from the pain. That was enough for now. 2 years later, I was sitting in the same porch swing, but the mountain around me had changed dramatically. The natural gas operation was in full swing, with access roads carved into the hillside and drilling equipment humming 24 hours a day. The noise had taken some getting used to, but the monthly royalty checks made it bearable. More importantly, the Beatrice Washington Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We now operated in 6 states, with a staff of 22 full-time employees. Vanessa had been promoted to executive director, overseeing programs that had helped prevent over $45 million in elder fraud and resulted in the arrest of 127 individuals involved in family-based financial abuse. But it was the letter I'd received that morning that made this visit to the lodge special. The return address read, Calvin Washington, Federal Correctional Institution, Memphis, Tennessee. I'd ignored his previous letters, letting them pile up unopened in a drawer at home. But something about today, maybe the crisp autumn air that reminded me of happier times, maybe the satisfaction of knowing the foundation was making a real difference, made me ready to hear what he had to say. I opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. Dear Pop, it began, and despite everything, that childhood nickname still hit me like a punch to the chest. I know I have no right to expect you to read this, let alone respond to it. I know the damage I've caused can never be repaired. But I wanted you to know what I've learned during these 2 years in prison, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I owe you the truth about who I've become. I've been working with a counselor here, Dr. Martinez, trying to understand how I became someone capable of planning your death. The gambling addiction was real, but it was never an excuse. Plenty of people have addictions without turning into would-be killers. The truth is harder to face. I was jealous of you. Jealous of your integrity, your marriage to Mom, your contentment with a simple life. I wanted wealth and status, and when I couldn't earn them honestly, I decided to steal them from the man who'd given me everything. I know about the foundation you and Vanessa started. The other inmates here call me the man whose father turned him into a case study. They're not wrong. I've become a cautionary tale, and I deserve to be. But I also want you to know that your work is saving lives. My cellmate, Rodriguez, called the foundation's tip line when he suspected his uncle was stealing from his elderly mother. You probably don't remember the case, Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez from El Paso, but the foundation helped her recover $78,000 and get her son arrested before he could do worse damage. Rodriguez says his mother lights a candle for you every Sunday at church. She calls you the angel who saved her from her own son. I told him you're not an angel. You're just a good man who refused to let evil win. I don't expect you to write back. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that I understand, finally, what I threw away. Not just the money or the property, but the chance to be the man you and Mom raised me to be. I have 6 more years in here minimum. I'm using that time to get my GED, then a college degree if possible. Dr. Martinez thinks I might be able to help counsel other inmates with gambling addictions. Maybe I can prevent someone else from making my choices. I love you, Pop. I know those words don't mean much coming from me anymore, but they're true. I love you, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I'm sorry for dishonoring Mom's memory. I'm sorry for betraying everything you taught me about family and honor, and doing right by people who depend on you. Your son, if I still have the right to call myself that. Calvin. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in the fading afternoon light. When I finished, I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket next to my heart, the same pocket where I carried a photo of Beatrice. For the first time in 2 years, Calvin sounded like the boy I'd raised instead of the stranger who'd tried to kill me. Was it real? Was this genuine remorse and growth, or just another manipulation from someone who'd proven capable of planning his father's murder? I didn't know. Maybe I'd never know for sure. But as I sat there watching the sun set over the Cumberland Mountains, I realized something important. It didn't matter whether Calvin's transformation was real or not. What mattered was that I'd survived his betrayal and built something meaningful from the wreckage. The foundation would continue its work long after I was gone. Families would be protected. Other elderly people would avoid the trap I'd almost fallen into. Calvin had tried to steal my legacy, but instead, he'd given me a purpose I never would have found otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Board meeting went great. We got approval for the Michigan expansion. Couldn't have done it without your vision, Mr. W. Thank you for trusting me with Beatrice's legacy. I smiled and typed back. Thank you for helping me turn the worst thing that ever happened to me into something good. As darkness settled over the mountain, I gathered myself to leave. But first, I walked over to the spot where Beatrice's wildflowers used to grow, now disturbed by the drilling operation. I'd transplanted the surviving flowers to a garden behind our house in town, but I still liked to visit the place where they'd first bloomed. Well, Beatrice, I said to the empty air, we did it. We saved some families from going through what ours did. Calvin might be finding his way back to being the man you wanted him to be. I don't know if I can ever forgive him, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for the choice I had to make. The mountain wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of machinery turning rock and earth into prosperity. But underneath it all, I could swear I heard Beatrice's voice, as clear as the day she'd said goodbye. You did right, Ezekiel. You chose love over hatred, justice over revenge, hope over despair. That's the man I married. That's the father Calvin needed, even if he couldn't see it then. I walked back to my truck, started the engine, and began the familiar drive down the mountain road. In the rearview mirror, I could see the lights of the drilling operation, steady and bright against the dark hillside. The mountain that had nearly become the site of my murder was now providing the resources to protect other families from similar fates. There was poetry in that, the kind Beatrice would have appreciated. At the bottom of the ridge, I stopped at the mailbox and pulled out Calvin's letter one more time. After a moment's hesitation, I took out my phone and typed a simple text message to the prison's family correspondence number. Calvin, I read your letter. I'm proud that you're taking responsibility and trying to help others. That's the son your mother raised. I don't know if I can forgive yet, but I'm glad you're finding your way back to being a good man. Love, Pop. I sent the message before I could change my mind, then drove home to the house where Beatrice and I had spent 47 years building a life together. Tomorrow, I'd go to the foundation office and help Vanessa plan our expansion into Michigan. We'd save more families, prevent more tragedies, turn more pain into protection. Calvin had taught me that family could betray you, But he'd also taught me that some betrayals could be survived and transformed into purpose. The mountain lodge would always carry the memory of what he'd tried to do there, but it would also remember what I'd built from the ashes of that betrayal. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I allowed myself to hope that somewhere in a federal prison in Memphis, my son was remembering too, not the man he'd become, but the boy he'd once been and the good man he might still choose to be. The mountain holds all our secrets, all our sins, all our hopes for redemption. But it also remembers love and family, and the truth that some things are worth more than money. That truth was worth fighting for. It was worth surviving for. It was worth forgiving for, when the time came. And maybe, just maybe, that time was coming sooner than I'd thought.